The fog hung over Bastogne like a burial shroud, thick and cold and unforgiving. December 22nd, 1944. The town that had once been a crossroads of commerce and conversation now served as a cage. 7 roads leading out like spokes on a wheel, and every one of them choked with German steel. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Staff Sergeant Michael Reilly pressed his back against the frozen stone of a demolished bakery and watched his breath crystallize in the air. His hands, wrapped in strips torn from a dead man's scarf, trembled not from fear but from the cold that had seeped into his bones over the past week. Around him, the 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles, they called themselves with a pride that even hunger couldn't diminish, held positions that seemed to shift and compress with each passing hour. The shelling had stopped an hour ago. That was worse than the noise. The silence meant the Germans were regrouping, planning, laughing in their warm bunkers about the Americans trapped like rabbits in a frozen snare. Reilly could still hear it sometimes, in the spaces between artillery fire. German voices carrying across the snow, confident and cruel. The sound of men who believed victory was merely a matter of time. They had reason to believe it. The panzer divisions had encircled Bastogne completely on the 21st, cutting supply lines, severing communications, leaving 10,000 American soldiers with dwindling ammunition, almost no medical supplies, and a food situation that had progressed from serious to desperate. Sarge. Private Tommy Kowalski appeared at his elbow, a kid from Pittsburgh with a baby face that made him look even younger than his 19 years. His helmet sat askew on his head, and his rifle, an M1 Garand that had saved his life twice in the last 3 days, hung loose in his grip. "Captain wants you at the command post. Says it's important." Reilly nodded, pushing himself away from the wall. His legs protested, stiff from hours of immobility in temperatures that had dropped to near zero. They moved through the ruins of what had been Bastogne's market square, past the hulking shadow of the damaged church where medics worked by candlelight on men who screamed or didn't scream, depending on how bad it was. The town had been beautiful once. Reilly had seen photographs in a magazine back at Camp Toccoa. Medieval architecture, cobblestone streets, cafe tables where people gathered to drink coffee and discuss ordinary things. Now it was a graveyard of shattered stone and splintered timber, every building bearing the scars of German 88s and Nebelwerfer rockets. Captain Frank Morrison stood hunched over a map spread across a makeshift table, 3 crates and a barn door. His face, illuminated by a kerosene lamp someone had scavenged from a basement, looked a decade older than it had 2 weeks ago. The siege did that, carved years into men in days. "Reilly." Morrison's voice was hoarse from shouting orders over artillery fire. "We've got a situation at the perimeter. Northeast quadrant. Germans are probing again. They hit us at dawn, pulled back, and now they're moving up mortars. I need you to take 2nd Squad and reinforce Lieutenant Hendricks. He's down to 18 men. 18 men to hold a sector that should have had 50. The mathematics of attrition." "Yes, sir." Reilly studied the map, committing the route to memory. "Supply situation?" Morrison's jaw tightened. "Each man gets 1 bandolier. That's it. Make every shot count." He paused, then added with a bitterness that cut through his professional demeanor. "Medical supplies are gone. If someone gets hit, all we can do is try to stop the bleeding and pray." Prayer had become currency in Bastogne. Men who hadn't set foot in a church since basic training now whispered desperate negotiations with God between mortar strikes. Reilly gathered his squad, 12 men, down from the 16 he'd had yesterday morning. They moved through the frozen streets in tactical intervals, weapons ready, eyes scanning the ruined buildings for movement. The snow crunched beneath their boots despite efforts at stealth. Everything in Bastogne made noise. The cold ensured it. They passed a cluster of civilians huddled in the basement of what had once been a schoolhouse. An old woman, her white hair visible beneath a threadbare shawl, watched them pass with eyes that held neither hope nor despair, just the blank acceptance of people who had seen their world torn apart. Her granddaughter, maybe 8 years old, clutched a doll with one arm missing. The girl had stopped crying days ago. That was another thing the siege did. It stole tears, replacing them with a hollow-eyed silence that was somehow worse. "Keep moving," Reilly whispered to his men, though part of him wanted to stop, to promise the woman and the child that relief was coming, that Patton's Third Army was racing north to break the siege. But promises were luxuries they couldn't afford. Men died on promises. They reached the northeast perimeter as dusk began to settle, that dangerous time when visibility turned treacherous and every shadow could hide a German patrol. Lieutenant Hendricks, a former schoolteacher from Vermont with a shrapnel scar bisecting his left eyebrow, greeted them with a grim nod. "They're out there." Hendricks pointed toward the tree line, barely visible through the snow and gathering darkness. "I can feel them. They've been moving equipment all afternoon. Something big." Reilly deployed his men along the defensive line. Foxholes dug into frozen earth so hard it had taken pickaxes to break through. The positions overlooked a field of snow that had once grown wheat. Now it grew nothing but the frozen corpses of men who had tried to cross it. Private First Class James Washington, a jazz musician from Harlem with hands that could coax magic from a trumpet, settled into the foxhole beside Reilly. "How long you think we got, Sarge?" "Long as it takes," Reilly replied, the standard non-answer that soldiers gave when the truth was too heavy to speak. But Washington pressed, his voice dropping to something rawer, more honest. "My sister wrote me. Letter finally got through 3 days before we got cut off. She's having a baby. First one. I was supposed to be there." Reilly looked at the young man, seeing not the soldier but the uncle-to-be, the brother, the musician whose hands were now wrapped around a rifle instead of an instrument. "You'll get there," he said, and meant it, because sometimes the lie was kinder than silence. The German attack came at 0300 hours, announced by the shriek of incoming mortars that turned the frozen night into a hell's cape of fire and shrapnel. Reilly pressed himself into the bottom of his foxhole as the earth erupted around him, throwing up geysers of dirt and snow and frozen blood. Then came the infantry, gray-clad figures moving through the smoke and darkness, their voices calling out in German, coordinated and professional. These weren't the inexperienced boys the Wehrmacht had been throwing at them earlier in the week. These were veterans, hardened men who knew their business. "Hold fire," Reilly commanded, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "Wait for my mark." The Germans advanced in a skirmish line, weapons ready, moving with the confidence of men who believed the Americans were already beaten. They were 30 yards out when Reilly gave the order. "Now!" The M1s opened up, their distinctive 8-round clips creating a staccato rhythm that punched through the darkness. Germans fell, but more kept coming, and Reilly realized with a sick certainty that this wasn't just a probe. This was a genuine assault, meant to crack their lines. Private Kowalski, firing with methodical precision, suddenly jerked backward, his helmet spinning away into the snow. He dropped without a sound. "Medic!" someone screamed. But there were no medics, not here, not with supplies gone and the aid stations overwhelmed. Washington scrambled from his foxhole, crawling through the snow toward Kowalski while tracers cut the air above him. He reached the fallen private, checked for a pulse, then looked back at Reilly and shook his head. The fight lasted 47 minutes by Reilly's watch. 47 minutes of sustained hell that left 12 Germans dead in the snow and cost them 3 more men they couldn't afford to lose. The survivors pulled back, but Reilly knew they'd be back. The Germans always came back. As dawn broke over Bastogne on December 23rd, the fog remained, and somewhere in the distance, muffled by snow and smoke, Reilly swore he could hear German laughter. The morning brought no relief, only a clearer view of their deterioration. Captain Morrison called a briefing for all squad leaders at 0800 hours in the cellar of the town hall, one of the few structures with enough roof remaining to provide cover from air-burst shells. Reilly descended the stone steps, his boots scraping against ice that had formed on the treads overnight. The cellar smelled of wet stone, unwashed men, and something else. The metallic tang of blood that seemed to permeate everything in Bastogne now, seeping into fabric and flesh until you couldn't remember what clean air tasted like. 7 other sergeants were already there, along with 3 lieutenants and Morrison himself. They gathered around that same makeshift table, now marked with countless pencil scratches tracking German positions, American casualties, supply levels that grew more desperate with each notation. Gentlemen, Morrison's voice had developed a rasp that wouldn't leave him for the rest of his life. Brigade has ordered us to hold. No retreat, no surrender. General McAuliffe's orders stand. Nuts. The famous reply to the German surrender demand had spread through the ranks like wildfire 2 days ago. When the Wehrmacht commander had sent formal papers demanding capitulation, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe had responded with a single word that captured both American defiance and dark humor. Nuts. The men had loved it. It had given them something to hold on to when ammunition ran low and the cold bit deeper. But now, standing in this cellar with maps that showed them completely surrounded, the word felt less like defiance and more like epitaph. Supply situation? Lieutenant Hendricks asked the question everyone was thinking. Morrison didn't sugarcoat it. Critical. We're rationing ammunition to 10 rounds per man per day. Food is down to 1 K ration every 24 hours. Medical supplies. He trailed off, then continued. Medical supplies are essentially non-existent. Doc Swanson is performing surgery with tools sterilized in melted snow. We've run out of morphine, sulfa, plasma, everything. Sergeant Bill McKenzie, a career soldier from Texas with a scar from North Africa mapping his jaw, spoke up. What about relief? Third Army. Patton's moving. Morrison's finger traced a line on the map heading north from Luxembourg. But he's fighting through the same weather we are, and the Germans know he's coming. They're throwing everything they have at him to slow him down. Could be days. Could be longer. Days. In Bastogne, days measured in hundreds of lives. Reilly returned to his squad as the sun tried unsuccessfully to burn through the fog. He found them huddled in a bombed-out grocery store, taking turns at a small fire they'd built from broken furniture. The fire was risky, smoke could draw artillery, but frostbite was killing almost as many men as German bullets. Washington sat with his back against a wall, hands wrapped around a canteen cup of weak coffee someone had brewed from grounds used 3 times already. His eyes had that 1,000-yard stare Reilly had seen too often, the look of a man who'd watched friends die and was trying to file the memory somewhere it wouldn't destroy him. "Talk to me, Washington," Reilly said, settling down beside him. The musician was quiet for a long moment, then spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I keep thinking about Tommy. Kowalski, he told me yesterday about his girl back home, Maria. They were supposed to get married in June. He had the ring in his pocket when he died. I checked." Reilly knew. He'd seen it when they'd gone through Kowalski's effects. A small diamond ring wrapped in a letter that started with "My dearest Tommy." He'd sealed it in an envelope that would eventually find its way to Pittsburgh, to a girl who would open it and feel her world collapse. "We're going to make it out of here," Reilly said, the platitude tasting like ash on his tongue. "You believe that, Sarge?" "I have to." The day crawled forward with agonizing slowness. The Germans shelled them sporadically, conserving ammunition for a final push they all knew was coming. Between bombardments, Reilly walked the lines, checking on his men, redistributing what little ammunition they had, making sure everyone had something resembling shelter. He found Private Eddie Chen, a Chinese-American kid from San Francisco who'd lied about his age to enlist, working on a Browning machine gun that had frozen in the night. Chen's fingers, blackened with frostbite at the tips, worked with meticulous care, coaxing the weapon back to functionality. "How's it looking?" Reilly asked. "She'll fire." Chen didn't look up from his work. "But the barrel's warped from the cold. Accuracy's going to be questionable after the first burst." "Better than nothing." "Yeah." Chen finally met his eyes. "Sarge, you really think Patton's coming?" There was something naked in the question, a vulnerability that the kid usually hid beneath technical competence and dark humor. Reilly recognized it for what it was, a plea for hope. "Patton doesn't leave men behind," Reilly said. "He's coming. We just have to hold until he gets here." The words felt true. George S. Patton Jr., that profane, brilliant, complicated warrior who wore pearl-handled revolvers and wrote poetry, would move heaven and earth to break the siege. The question wasn't whether he'd come. The question was whether they'd still be alive when he arrived. In the town center, near the church where the medics worked their miracles and witnessed their failures, Reilly encountered Father Benoit, a Belgian priest who'd refused to evacuate when the Germans encircled the town. The old man moved among the wounded with a calmness that seemed almost supernatural, offering last rites to the dying and comfort to those who would survive but never forget. Sergeant Reilly. Father Benoit's English carried a French accent thick as winter fog. You look troubled. Just tired, Father. We are all tired. The priest gestured toward the church. But tired men can still do God's work. Would you help me move some of the wounded? The cellar is warmer. They worked in silence, carrying stretchers down narrow stairs, trying not to jostle men whose injuries screamed at the slightest movement. One soldier, his abdomen wrapped in bandages that were more red than white, grabbed Reilly's wrist as they settled him onto a cot. Tell my mom, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Tell her I wasn't scared. You'll tell her yourself, Reilly replied. But the lie felt heavier this time, and when the soldier's grip loosened and his eyes unfocused, Reilly knew another letter would need to be written. That night, as temperatures plummeted and the aurora borealis painted impossible colors across the northern sky, Reilly stood watch at his position and thought about all the letters he'd have to write. Each one would try to capture a life. The things that made Private Kowalski laugh, the way Washington played trumpet, the precise way Chen could field strip a weapon blindfolded. But words on paper couldn't hold the weight of memory, couldn't capture the particular way a man faced death. The German laughter came again near midnight, carried on a wind that cut through every layer of clothing. They were close enough now that Reilly could make out individual voices, could hear them singing drinking songs and celebrating Christmas early. The Wehrmacht had schnapps and warm bunkers and the confidence of men who believed they'd won. Reilly listened to that laughter and felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. Not quite hate, soldiers rarely hated the enemy. That took energy they didn't have. But a grim determination, a refusal to give these men the satisfaction of victory. They won't laugh forever, Washington said from the foxhole beside him. No, Reilly agreed, checking his rifle one more time, feeling the weight of his remaining ammunition. They won't. Somewhere to the south, beyond the encircling ring of German steel, George Patton's Third Army was grinding north through snow and resistance. But here in Bastogne, on the frozen night of December 23rd, all they had was the determination to see one more dawn, and the promise that when relief came, not if but when, they'd still be standing, still holding, still defiant. December 24th arrived with the same fog, the same cold, and something new, the sound of aircraft engines overhead. For one desperate moment, hope surged through the ranks. Air support, supplies, reinforcement from above. Then the first bombs fell. Luftwaffe bombers, materializing out of the cloud cover like mechanical vultures, unloaded their payloads across Bastogne with methodical precision. The earth shook as explosions rippled through the town, collapsing buildings that had somehow survived the artillery, crushing civilians who'd thought their basements were safe. Reilly and his squad pressed themselves into their foxholes as the world erupted around them. The sound was beyond deafening, a physical assault that made ears bleed and thoughts fragment. Private Chen, curled into a ball in the frozen earth, was praying in Cantonese, his voice lost beneath the screaming of bombs. The raid lasted 17 minutes. When it ended, smoke rose from a dozen new fires, and the casualty count had jumped by numbers nobody wanted to calculate. Morrison found Reilly an hour later, his face smudged with soot and something that might have been someone else's blood. The church took a direct hit. Half the medical staff is dead. Father Benoit. He didn't finish the sentence. Reilly felt something crack inside him, some final reserve of compassion or hope or humanity. The priest had been a good man. The world had fewer good men now. We need to consolidate positions, Morrison continued. All business, because business was the only thing keeping him from screaming. Pull your squad back to the secondary line. Germans are massing for a push. Intelligence says they're bringing up reserves from the Führer Grenadier Brigade. Elite troops, fresh troops, men who hadn't been starving and freezing for a week. The mathematics kept getting worse. They pulled back through streets that no longer resembled anything urban, just cratered moonscapes of rubble and frozen blood, littered with the detritus of war. Washington stopped beside a shattered storefront where a sign still hung, Boulangerie du Bois, the bakery where Reilly had taken position on the first day of the siege. "My grandfather owned a bakery in Harlem," Washington said suddenly. "Used to wake up at 4 a.m. to start the bread. Said there was something holy about feeding people. I never understood what he meant until now." "What do you mean?" Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Washington gestured at the ruins around them. "All this destruction, it's the opposite of holy, isn't it? Instead of feeding people, we're destroying everything." "And for what?" "For freedom," Reilly said, but the word felt inadequate. "Yeah." Washington nodded slowly. "Yeah, I guess that's worth something." The German attack came at 1,400 hours, heralded by the now familiar scream of Nebelwerfer rockets. Screaming Memis. The Americans called them six-barreled launchers that created a psychological terror almost worse than their actual destructive capability. But this time, the rockets were just the overture. Panzers rolled forward through the fog, Mark IVs and Panthers, their 75mm guns traversing to target American positions. Behind them came the infantry, gray waves of them, moving with disciplined precision that spoke of training and confidence. Reilly's squad, positioned in a bombed-out apartment building, opened fire with everything they had. The Browning machine gun, despite its warped barrel, chattered its defiant song. M1s cracked. A bazooka team, down to their last 3 rockets, scored a direct hit on a Mark IV, sending it up in a pillar of flame. But more kept coming. "They're flanking left," Lieutenant Hendricks shouted from his position 20 yards away. "Reilly, shift fire." They adjusted, pouring rounds into the gray tide trying to envelop their position. Washington, firing with mechanical precision, dropped 3 Germans before a mortar round landed close enough to throw him against a wall. He got back up, bleeding from a dozen shrapnel wounds, and kept firing. Chen's machine gun fell silent. Not jammed, but out of ammunition. The kid switched to his rifle without hesitation, dropping to one knee to improve his accuracy. The battle devolved into the chaos that all close combat becomes. A confusion of smoke and noise and the animal fear that lives in every human heart. Reilly found himself fighting hand-to-hand with a German sergeant, their rifles abandoned, grappling in the frozen rubble with the desperate ferocity of men who knew only one of them would see another sunrise. He won. The German didn't. When the Wehrmacht finally pulled back 2 hours later, they left 37 of their own dead in the snow. But the Americans had lost 9 men they couldn't replace, and the ammunition situation had gone from critical to catastrophic. Morrison, visiting each position to assess damage, looked like death itself. "We can't sustain this. One more push like that and we're done." "Then we better hope Patton hurries," Reilly replied, reloading his rifle with the last ammunition he'd been able to scrounge. That night, Christmas Eve in Bastogne, something broke in the weather. The fog lifted just enough for starlight to penetrate, and with it came a sight that would become legend. C-47 transport planes, dozens of them, appearing overhead like aluminum angels. The Germans opened up with everything, filling the sky with tracer fire and flak bursts. But the planes kept coming, and from their bellies tumbled parachutes, white flowers blooming against the dark sky. Supplies, ammunition, medical equipment, food. Men who had been too exhausted to move suddenly found energy to run toward the drop zones, dodging German fire, pulling in the precious cargo. Reilly grabbed a container that landed 30 feet from his position, popping it open to find ammunition, plasma, sulfa drugs. Washington laughed. Actually laughed. The first genuine sound of joy Reilly had heard from him in days. "Sarge, they got coffee. Real coffee." All across Bastogne, the Americans rallied. It wasn't victory. They were still surrounded, still outnumbered, but it was hope, tangible and real. The supply drop wouldn't win the siege, but it would let them hold longer. Long enough for Patton to arrive. In the German lines, the laughter stopped. They'd seen the planes too, understood what it meant. The Americans weren't going to starve, weren't going to run out of ammunition. The easy victory had become complicated. Reilly sat in his foxhole that night, sipping real coffee for the first time in a week, and allowed himself to believe they might actually survive. Around him, his men, the ones who remained, cleaned weapons with renewed vigor, rationed out the new supplies with careful precision, and told jokes that weren't quite as forced as before. Morrison appeared near midnight, moving through the positions like a ghost. When he reached Reilly, he simply nodded, an acknowledgement that passed between professional soldiers who'd been through hell together. "Third Army's 20 miles out," Morrison said quietly, the words nearly lost beneath distant artillery fire. "Patton's pushing hard. Intelligence says he'll be here by the 26th. 2 more days. 48 more hours. They could do that." In the darkness beyond their perimeter, German voices called out. Not laughter this time. Orders. The movement of equipment. The Wehrmacht was preparing for something. "They're going to try to break us before relief arrives," Reilly observed. "Probably." Morrison lit a cigarette, cupping the flame against the wind. "But they're going to fail. You know why? Why? Because we're too damn stubborn to die." It wasn't poetry. It wasn't inspirational. But it was true, and in Bastogne on Christmas Eve 1944, truth was the only currency that mattered. Christmas Day in Bastogne dawned clear, the first truly clear sky since the siege began. It was beautiful and terrible in equal measure, because clear skies meant German artillery could target with precision, could see exactly where the Americans were dug in. But it also meant American air support could find them. At 0900 hours, P-47 Thunderbolts screamed out of the sun, their .50 caliber machine guns ripping into German positions. The fighter bombers came in low, so low that Reilly could see the pilots' faces as they pulled up after their attack runs, and the sound, the beautiful, terrible sound of American air power, shook the frozen earth. The German artillery fell silent. Their panzers, which had been moving up for another assault, scattered into the tree lines. For the first time in days, the balance had shifted. In his command post, Morrison allowed himself a tight smile. "Patton's close. I can feel it." He was right. 22 miles to the south, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams was leading the spearhead of the 4th Armored Division through waist-deep snow and determined German resistance. Behind him, thousands more men and hundreds of vehicles pushed north with single-minded determination. George S. Patton Jr., orchestrating the relief from his headquarters, had performed what military historians would later call a miracle, pivoting his entire 3rd Army 90 degrees in the middle of winter, in the middle of a battle, and driving them north through some of the worst conditions of the war. It violated every principle of prudent military logistics. It was brilliant. It was insane. It was working. But in Bastogne, they didn't know the details. They only knew that somewhere beyond the German ring, help was coming, and they had to hold just a little longer. The Wehrmacht, knowing time was running out, threw everything at them. At 1100 hours, a concentrated barrage fell on the eastern perimeter, the heaviest shelling of the siege. Buildings that had survived a week of bombardment simply ceased to exist, atomized by high explosives. Men disappeared into craters that swallowed them whole. Then came the armor. 8 panzers, supported by 2 companies of infantry, rolled toward the American positions in a coordinated assault designed to crack the line before 3rd Army arrived. Reilly, positioned with the 101 Estes anti-tank teams, watched them come through his field glasses. "Steady," he called to the bazooka teams. "Wait for the range." Beside him, Private Chen had somehow located another machine gun, this one with a straight barrel, and was feeding belt ammunition with methodical care. Washington crouched in a nearby crater, his rifle ready, his eyes tracking the approaching enemy. "Now!" Reilly shouted. The bazookas fired, their rockets leaving trails of smoke as they streaked toward the panzers. 2 tanks erupted in flames. A third took a track hit and slewed sideways, blocking the advance of those behind it. The German infantry, suddenly without armor support in the open, became targets. Chen's machine gun opened up, stitching tracers across the snow. Washington fired, reloaded, fired again with the rhythm of a man who'd done this too many times. The Germans wavered, then broke, retreating back toward their lines, leaving bodies behind. But the victory was costly. A Panther, hanging back to provide covering fire, had zeroed in on Chen's position. The 75mm round hit with the force of a meteor, and Private Eddie Chen, the boy from San Francisco who'd lied about his age, ceased to exist except as memory. Reilly felt the shockwave wash over him, felt something hot and wet splash against his face. He didn't look, couldn't look, just kept firing, kept shouting orders, kept doing what soldiers do when their world is ending around them. The day ground on with that same mixture of hope and horror. More supplies came in via parachute drops. More men died holding the line. The math continued its brutal calculus. As evening approached, washing the battlefield in shades of orange and red that looked too much like blood, a new sound echoed from the south. Artillery. American artillery. Heavy guns, firing in a pattern that could only mean one thing. Third Army was in range. Morrison appeared at Reilly's position, his face transformed. "They're here." Forward observers report lead elements of 4th Armored are engaging German positions 3 miles south. They're punching through. 3 miles. In normal conditions, nothing. But with the Germans fighting desperately to maintain the encirclement, every yard would be contested. The night of December 25th became a strange purgatory of waiting. German attacks continued, but with less conviction now, as if the Wehrmacht soldiers could feel the tide turning. American defenders, exhausted beyond measure, held their positions with renewed determination. Reilly sat in his foxhole, cleaning his rifle for the 100th time, when Washington dropped down beside him. The musician's face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, but something had changed in him over the past days. A hardening, or perhaps a clarification of what mattered. "Sarge," Washington said quietly, "when we get out of here, and we're gonna get out, I'm gonna go home and play my trumpet on every street corner in Harlem. I'm gonna make music until people remember what beauty sounds like." "That's a good plan," Reilly replied. "And I'm going to tell my niece, the one that's being born. I'm going to tell her about every man who died here. Not just their names. Who they were. Tommy Kowalski, who loved a girl named Maria. Eddie Chen, who could fix anything. Father Benoit, who died helping people he'd never met. She's going to know. She'll know," Reilly promised, and in that moment, in that frozen foxhole on the edge of survival, he understood what Washington's grandfather had meant about the holiness of creation. Every act of remembrance, every story told, was an act of creation, building meaning from chaos, raising monuments of memory against the darkness. December 26, 1944. Dawn came with the sound of tank treads and diesel engines. Not German engines. American engines. The unmistakable rumble of M4 Shermans and M5 Stuarts, growing louder with each passing minute. Reilly climbed out of his foxhole, standing fully upright for the first time in days, not caring if German snipers could see him. All across the American lines, men were doing the same, rising from their defensive positions to watch the southern horizon. At 1,645 hours, the lead tanks of the 4th Armored Division's 37th Tank Battalion rolled into Bastogne from the south, their guns still smoking from the fighting that had opened the corridor. Behind them came half-tracks, jeeps, ambulances, supply trucks, the entire magnificent logistics train of an American armored division. The German ring was broken. Men cheered. Some cried. Morrison stood in the middle of the road, saluting as the first Sherman rolled past, and the tank commander, a lieutenant who couldn't have been older than 25, saluted back with a grin that split his dirty face. Patton himself arrived hours later, standing in his jeep like a conquering Caesar, surveying the wreckage of Bastogne with the eyes of a man who delivered on an impossible promise. He found General McAuliffe in what remained of the command post. "How are you, General?" Patton asked, his voice carrying that patrician accent that somehow never sounded pretentious when lives depended on it. McAuliffe, looking like he'd aged 20 years in a week, managed a tired smile. "Glad to see you, George." That night, with the siege broken but the Battle of the Bulge far from over, Reilly walked through Bastogne's ruins. He found the cellar where the civilians had sheltered, The old woman and the girl with the one-armed doll. They were still alive, somehow, and when the grandmother saw him, she took his hand and spoke in French he didn't understand but recognized as gratitude. The girl held up her doll, showing him that someone had repaired its arm with strips of parachute silk. The corridor opened by Patton's Third Army remained narrow and contested throughout the last days of December. German forces, though pushed back from Bastogne's immediate perimeter, hadn't abandoned their offensive. They probed the flanks, launched counterattacks, and continued to shell the town with diminished but still lethal artillery fire. But everything had changed. Supplies flowed in. Fresh troops reinforced the battered defenders. Medical facilities expanded from overwhelmed aid stations to functioning field hospitals. The men of the 101st Airborne and the other units that had held Bastogne were no longer slowly dying. They were healing, rebuilding, preparing to push forward. Reilly's squad, reduced to 9 men from the original 16, spent the next week in positions along the expanded perimeter. They watched as the 4th Armored Division pushed outward, widening the corridor, crushing German positions that had tormented them for so long. On New Year's Eve, Morrison gathered what remained of the company for a formation in front of the damaged church. Over 100 men had stood there on December 16th. 43 stood there now. "We held," Morrison said simply, his voice carrying across the ruined square. "When the Germans demanded surrender, we told them nuts. When they tried to starve us, we rationed what we had. When they surrounded us, we made them bleed for every yard. We held." He paused, looking at each face. Young faces aged by war, eyes that had seen too much, shoulders that carried the weight of lost friends. "The casualty lists are being compiled. Letters are being written. I know that's no comfort to the families who'll receive them, but I want you to know something. Every man who fell here died holding the line. The German advance was stopped here. The tide of the Battle of the Bulge turned here. In Bastogne." Someone in the ranks, Reilly couldn't see who, began to sing. Quietly at first, then with growing strength. "Silent night, holy night." Other voices joined, a ragged chorus of survivors singing in the ruins of a town they'd saved. Washington stood beside Reilly, his voice, that beautiful instrument that should have been playing jazz in Harlem nightclubs, rising above the others. When the song ended, he turned to Reilly with tears frozen on his cheeks. "We made it, Sarge." "Yeah," Reilly replied, thinking of Kowalski and Chen and the dozen others who hadn't. "We made it." The reorganization began in early January. The 101st Airborne, though still combat effective, needed rest, needed reinforcement, needed time to absorb replacements and restore unit cohesion. They were pulled back from the front lines, replaced by fresh divisions pushing east. Before they left, Reilly returned to the northeastern perimeter where his squad had spent so many desperate hours. The foxholes were still there, frozen into the earth. Spent shell casings littered the ground. Dark stains in the snow marked where men had fallen. He found Private Kowalski's foxhole and stood there for a long moment, thinking about the kid from Pittsburgh who'd worried about his girl, Maria. Thinking about the ring that would arrive in Pennsylvania with a letter explaining that the man she loved had died quickly, without pain. The lie that all condolence letters contained. "I'm sorry, Tommy," Reilly said to the empty air. "I'm sorry I couldn't get you home." A hand fell on his shoulder. Morrison stood beside him, looking older than his 32 years, bearing the weight that all commanders carry when they survive and their men don't. "You did everything right," Morrison said. "You kept them alive as long as humanly possible. That's all any of us can do. It doesn't feel like enough. It never does." Morrison stared out at the field where so many attacks had been beaten back. "But they held this line, Reilly. Every one of them. And because they held, the German offensive failed. We'll push them back to Germany now. Maybe end the war months earlier than if Bastogne had fallen. Your men, our men, might have saved thousands of lives by giving their own." It was cold comfort, but it was something. The 101st Airborne left Bastogne on January 9, 1945, trucking west toward rest areas where they could recover from the siege. As they drove through the town's outskirts, civilians emerged from their shelters to line the streets. They waved American flags, tattered things they'd hidden from the Germans. They threw flowers, though where they'd found flowers in winter was a mystery. The old woman from the schoolhouse basement stood with her granddaughter. And when Reilly's truck passed, the girl held up her doll with the parachute silk arm and waved it frantically. Reilly waved back, and for a moment, just a moment, the weight lifted. Washington, sitting across from him in the truck bed, pulled out a harmonica someone had given him. He played When the Saints Go Marching In, the notes carrying across the frozen landscape, and the men of the 101st Airborne, the screaming eagles who'd held Bastogne, sang along. They drove past destroyed panzers, abandoned German equipment, the frozen corpses of Wehrmacht soldiers who'd believed they would win, past the tree line where German voices had called out in confident expectation of victory. The laughter had ended. The ring was shattered. Bastogne stood at a field hospital outside Paris. Reilly finally had time to write the letters he'd been composing in his head for weeks. He sat at a desk in a Quonset hut, a stack of blank paper before him, and began with the hardest one. "Dear Maria," he wrote, forming each letter with care. "My name is Staff Sergeant Michael Reilly, and I had the honor of serving with Private Tommy Kowalski." He wrote for hours, filling pages with memories. Tommy's sense of humor, his courage, his love for a girl he'd left behind. He described how Tommy had died instantly, felt no pain, the lie, had spoken Maria's name at the end, the greater lie. He explained about the ring, which was being sent separately, and tried to capture in words what it meant that Tommy had carried it through hell, intending to present it to her when he came home. When he finished, he sealed the envelope and moved to the next letter. Then the next. Letters to parents, to siblings, to widows and children. Each one a small monument to a life that had ended in the frozen hell of Bastogne. Washington found him there at midnight, still writing by lamplight. "You need sleep, Sarge. I need to finish these." Washington pulled up a chair. "Then I'll help." Together they wrote through the night, two soldiers crafting careful monuments of memory. When dawn broke over the field hospital, 13 letters sat sealed and ready, each one carrying the weight of a life that had ended defending a Belgian crossroads town most Americans had never heard of. The war ground on. The 101st Airborne would fight again in Alsace in Germany itself. Some would fall in those later battles. But Bastogne remained their crucible, the place where they'd been tested beyond human endurance and refused to break. Years later, when historians wrote about the Battle of the Bulge, they would call Bastogne the turning point. They would analyze the strategic importance of the road network, the failure of German logistics, the impact of American air superiority once the weather cleared. They would note that the siege tied down German forces that could have been deployed elsewhere, that it disrupted the timetable of the Ardennes offensive, that it demonstrated American resolve at a critical moment. But Reilly remembered it differently. He remembered the cold that seeped into bones and never quite left. The sound of German laughter in the darkness. The weight of letters he had to write. The faces of men who held their positions because surrender wasn't in their vocabulary. Washington went home to Harlem, played his trumpet on every corner like he'd promised, and told his niece stories about Bastogne when she was old enough to understand. Morrison became a high school principal in Ohio, teaching history with the authority of someone who'd lived it. And Reilly? He returned to Bastogne in 1969, an aging veteran walking streets he'd defended as a young man. The town had been rebuilt, beautiful again, with cafes and shops and people living ordinary lives. In the market square stood a monument listing the names of the defenders, Kowalski, Chen, and all the others. An old Belgian woman approached him, perhaps recognizing something in his bearing. She spoke in accented English. "Thank you for our freedom." Reilly looked at the monument, at the names carved in stone, and replied with the only words that felt adequate. "We held." Subscribe to Stories Between Conflicts, where silence is never forgotten.